I'm from Illinois, and I have a pretty large family. Some of them are very religious, the type of religious that don't celebrate Halloween and frowns at anything connected to the supernatural. Now, I won't go into particular problems in my family, because I know nobody cares about those type of mundane details. But what I do think is you'll be interested in hearing about my aunt. She lives in Louisiana, and not only is she a mixed woman, but also, let's say, eccentric. Unlike the rest of my family, she's a total believer in ghosts and monsters and unexplainable phenomenon, and she's very open about it. That's what really drives my family up the wall. She'll do things like refuse to sit in certain areas of a building, claiming there's negative energy. She'll also do tarot readings for anybody willing to sit and let her. I used to be more in the middle myself. I believed in aliens and ghosts, sure, but not monsters or cryptids. Anyway, one summer, her health kind of took a dip, so my mother asked me if I'd go spend a month or so with her to help around the house. I did not hesitate to say yes. I really enjoyed my aunt. Besides, I never really traveled outside of Illinois before. A couple of weeks after I'd arrived, I managed to land a part-time job at a small restaurant that was set right by the waters of the bayou. It was built on a platform with a wide wooden porch. I phoned my mom to tell her I planned to stay the whole remaining summer. She was happy about my decision, but also warned me to be careful. Living near the bayou is much different from living in an urban city. One shocking thing was all the alligators. They'd just be lounging about next to the waters, not doing a whole lot. I was told that as long as I didn't feed them or bother them, they wouldn't want anything to do with me. Coming from a town where the most worried we were trash pandas, I was definitely hyper-aware of my surroundings. So, one night, I was dragging some trash outside to toss in the garbage bin on the opposite side of the smaller parking lot. It was when I was on my way back, I noticed some movement in the waters. The moon was full, and the restaurant also provided a lot of light. I thought it might be a gator, so I kept my eyes on it while I got closer to the stairs. What happened next made me scream and jump back. A hand reached out of the water, grasping onto one of the beams holding up the restaurant. As soon as I screamed, the hand disappeared back into the water. I could still see the ripples. I stood frozen, waiting for it to reappear. Now, when I say it was a hand, I mean a hand. Like a human-shaped hand, not a paw. I'm positive I saw sharp claws at the ends of those long fingers. It was not an animal, and it couldn't have been a human either. The skin was not smooth. I could not see it clearly enough to really get details. Maybe the skin was scaly. It looked kind of brownish or green. I don't know how long I stood there, but nothing happened again. The water stayed still. There was not a sign of anything, not even a gator. Eventually, I had to get back to work, and apparently nobody had heard the scream. The restaurant is pretty loud, to be fair, but it did make me wonder, what would have happened if that thing, whatever it was, had attacked me? Would anybody have even heard me in time? I could have died that night. I was lucky that thing chose to disappear, because it still gives me chills just thinking back to it. For the rest of my shift, I kept replaying what I saw over and over again in my head. I was shaky and quiet. Some of my coworkers questioned me. I lied, said I didn't feel good. They let me leave early. As soon as I got home, I told my aunt. She was still awake, waiting for me, and her face looked very serious. After I described the hand, she nodded, told me all about walking lizard men. She claimed they're smart and observant creatures, that they watch and understand us. Lizard men know only to attack those who won't be missed, or at least won't cause a huge manhunt. With volunteers and dogs in the works, she warned me to be careful and to stay away from the waters. She also asked me to quit my job and find a new one in town. I did not at first, despite how freaked I was. I really enjoyed the restaurant, and it had only been a couple weeks since I began. I felt bad just quitting like that so soon. But then, another night, I caught sight of two glowing eyes in the water. They weren't moving. It was just two small white orbs floating in pitch blackness. I felt chilled. I was certain it was looking at me, watching me. Maybe it was just a lone alligator, but something told me it was the same thing that had reached out of the water. That was the last straw for me. I quit the next day. Nothing else ever happened to me since that summer. Now, before that happened, I wouldn't have believed this one. Lizard men. But after seeing a reptilian human-shaped hand with my own eyes, I believed it. I began to believe everything my aunt said after that. Like I stated before, I'd always liked her, and we had a better relationship than she had with the rest of the family. I was not condescending, and I never lectured her. To this day, we're still very close, and she was the only one I'd ever told about the lizard man to, until now. I found this story when I was scrolling the other day. I thought it was interesting. I asked for permission to post it, but it was posted months ago, so I'm assuming they abandoned the account. Anyway, here it is. My Haitian grandmother used to warn me about the mermaids that haunted the waters around the island. Mermaids aren't the fun-loving depicted creatures singing songs of the deep. She always warned me that I shouldn't make a deal with a creature if I wasn't willing to pay for it. She learned that lesson of her very own. For years, she wouldn't tell me what the deal was because she did not want me to follow in her footsteps. When her sister got sick, I wanted to go with her and support her while she was there, but she forbid it. My parents had insisted that I listen to my elders, and I'd be absolutely destroyed when I got news that my great aunt had died without me nearby. I'd grown up with her, baking and sewing and telling jokes. When she moved back to Haiti, I'd begged to go back with her, even if it was only for a little while, but nobody had been willing to allow it then either. I didn't talk to anybody in my family for a while after that, too angry about being kept away from my part of my heritage. I thought it was rather unfair and cruel, but I couldn't stay away for long, especially not when she returned with no left eye. She told us that somebody had mistaken her for a tourist and attacked her for her wallet. Mom had sent me to my room that whatever conversation followed had been lost to me. Later in the week, I found myself feeling like horse dung. Because, despite losing her sister and her eyes in the same week, my grandmother had come bearing gifts. I didn't question her again after that. When my grandma's time came and she was gazing up at the ceiling, that was when I got my answers. When she was a teenager, my grandmother wanted nothing more than to save her mother. She had been diagnosed at the time with an incurable disease and left with only months to live. My grandma had gone to the water's edge with stolen jewelry and bangles and sworn she'd give anything if they could cure her mother. The anything they wanted was her firstborn grandchild. She'd agreed, desperate to save her mother, and the deal was struck. Her mother miraculously regained her health and died 40 years later of old age. When she died, my mom reported feeling nauseous, and my family panicked. They hopped on the first plane to the States, moving inland, far away from rivers, lakes, and oceans. For years, they would not let me stare too long into puddles or splash about in the tub. And now, I know why. I missed a very precious part of my life because my family was so superstitious. Insane, maybe. I found myself silently sitting as I listened to the rest of the story. The mermaids got her eye when she was too close to the river, and if not for the men helping her collect water, she'd have been dragged down with them. My grandmother died a bit after telling me that secret, that I'm writing this as event as I wait to take a plane, taking off to Haiti. No longer was I willing to miss out on a part of myself for the sake of superstition. So, if you don't want to hear from me again, I guess you can assume mermaids got me. That's all there was, and I could not find an update. So if you're still out there, then I hope you won't be too upset for me showing your story and posting it here. I live in the middle of literally nowhere, in a very extremely rural part of Kansas. There are just 3 other houses and a good 5-mile radius from my home, and the nearest town, which is Anthony, is a good 1 hour away. My family has been living in this house for 3 generations now. I love it here. The peace, the ability to grow my own food on my own farm, and the independence of not having to bow down to the rules of society, not as much as living in the city. I never really liked the idea of living in a busy town, large crowds and lots of hustle bustle. It makes me feel trapped and claustrophobic. Every day, after my wife and I are done eating, I take the leftovers, along with some boiled eggs, to go feed the street dogs that live in the field behind my house, which is right near the forest. I give them food and give them love. They kind of guard the area. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship. I don't really have dogs of my own yet, but these strays are near as good. Now, this arrangement has been going on for quite a while now. Every day, almost as if they have a biological clock, they come out and line up along the forest, waiting for food to come in their bowls. They know when their feeding is. We are set to a routine that I never, ever go off of. Last month, something happened. As usual, I'd come out to feed them at around exactly 11 a.m., but they weren't there. This has happened in literally years, so their absence really caught me off guard. I tried calling out for them and looking around for them, but they were nowhere to be found. Not a single one of them was visible. I could hear soft growling noises, though, a couple of times, but every time I looked in the direction of the sound, there was never anything. I would tell myself I just imagined it. After waiting for a good 15 minutes in anticipation, I went back home, disappointed and extremely, extremely worried. They were all healthy, vaccinated and very friendly dogs, and been my best pals for years, so I couldn't help but imagine the worst. For 3 weeks, I continued going to our spot at our time, with my food in hand and hope in my eyes. Every day, I returned home with more and more worry. My wife, who hasn't spent half as much time with the dogs as I, told me that the pack probably found a better spot to live, a better food supply, etc. I just know that can't be true. But since I refused to believe that something bad had happened, I had to settle for that. Regardless, I continued to go to that same spot every day and sit there thinking of them for at least 10 minutes. This was until last Friday, when it happened. I'd been sitting on the foldable stool that I brought with me some food. Having lost track of time while submerged in my own thoughts, I had stayed longer than I did that day. At around 11:45, I heard a bark. I got excited and my heart began racing. I got up. I wanted to be happy, but my mind told me something was off. The bark was not one that belonged to any member of my pack. It was deep, coarse, and appeared full of aggression. However, my heart told me to look, and so I did. I picked up the bag of food, walking in the direction of the bark, to welcome my furry friends back. The bark had come within the forest. I was just about to open my bag to take out a handful of chicken bones when I saw it. From the darkness had emerged a set of brightly glowing red eyes, embedded like diamonds on a gray Malamute's face that sat on a body taller than my own. I staggered, fell back, got up, fell back again. My legs were shaking extremely violently. This thing or monster took another step towards me, growling. It was that very growl that I'd heard on the day my dogs had vanished. It had been soft then, probably because of the distance between the dog and I. But now that it was standing right here, I could sense the sheer aggression that oozed from it. With another step, this beast approached out of the darkness into the day, revealing its astonishing physique. This thing easily was 10 feet tall, standing upright and snarling. It had huge pointed ears that appeared to be the size of my head alone, and its shoulders, although hunched, were twice as wide. It was covered by a thick coat of dark, woolly gray hair, and its partially open mouth revealed a row of teeth. With more adrenaline in my body than blood, I threw my bag of food towards it to distract it, and it somehow worked. Just as this thing turned to grab the food, I pushed myself up, commanding my legs to work like they are meant to, and hurried back home. My wife saw that I was drenched in sweat and panting like a seal. so she asked me what was up. Not wanting to scare her, I kept quiet. Told her that I had tripped and excused myself to the bathroom. That was when it hit me. The monster had probably eaten my dogs, and now posed a threat to my very wife and I. With that thought in my mind, everything became a blur. I told her that we were going on a road trip, to get into her car. I threw in some of our clothing, my shotgun, and some cash in the trunk. I refused to answer any of her questions until we were out of the garage and on the road. Then, I told her everything. I could feel the look of horror on her face, but I was holding myself together by the threads, and I had looked at her, scared, and faced the moment. I would have broken down like I never have. I kept my eyes glued to the road and drove 40 miles out to a motel that we're currently staying at. I don't have the heart to face that thing one more time. Not right now. I haven't figured out anything yet, and I don't know when I will. For now, everything feels surreal to me. Reality is a nightmare at this point. It feels like a bubble, ready to burst at any time. Whatever we decide to do, I'll update you guys, and until then, pray for me. I need it. Please. To this day, my mom swears she saw a UFO. One chilly night, long before my sister and I were born, her and Dad were hanging out in a park long after dark. She won't say why they were there, but my sister suspects they were doing something sordid, since they never let her go to the park alone with her boyfriend. I, however, don't think that's really the point. The point is that my mom doesn't explain what led up to the supposed UFO sighting. She jumps from entering the park to hunting for the source of sound that had interrupted her conversation. Apparently, there was a ton of smoke, and Dad had insisted they get out of there before the fire department found them and blamed them for something they had not done. Mom had not listened and ran into the forest without him. She always described it as a pulling in her chest that demanded her immediate attention. At the time, she hadn't heard Dad screaming at her to stop or wait. She had hardly been aware of the fact that she was racing off at all. By the time my dad caught up, she was screaming that she'd seen a UFO. It repaired itself before her very eyes, then shot back into the sky. To this day, her and Dad argued endlessly about what she'd actually seen. He always tried to shut her up when she got too loud about it. Sometimes, though, when Dad was gone, she'd come into my room and tell me about the way the colors had swirled around the spinning disk that propelled them up and away from the earth. She would tell me that the movies had it all wrong, with the bulbous heads, but from what she could see, there was some kind of merit to the void-like eyes and gray skin. It was like the wild story in her arsenal. But I believe her somehow. No matter what Dad said, it felt real. This incident happened to me when I was 14 and went on a picnic with my parents. It was later at night, and we were returning back. The time clock hit was 3 in the morning. My dad was driving the car with my mom in the passenger seat. My brother and I both sat in the back seat. I woke up in the middle of the night when I heard my father saying we're low on gas. We saw a gas station. It was northeastern Louisiana, and nobody was really present there. The road was deserted. The gas station appeared to be too. There was a small lodge present, right beside the gas station. I was so thirsty. I asked my father if I can get off for a chocolate milk from the vending machine outside the gate. I got off and walked toward the machine, put some coins in, but I guess it was not working. Some footsteps were approaching me. I thought it was my father. It was a man, perhaps the owner of the lodge. He asked me if the machine was not working. I regret looking back. I should have never answered him. When I looked back, he was tapping on the sides of a machine. I was standing behind him, looking at him, fixing the machine for me. The machine was finally beginning to work again. He picked up the milk can and handed it over to me. I took the can from his hands. They were very cold. When I looked up at his face, I could not see it well because he was standing in front of ceiling lights, and it was illuminating his long face. After taking 2 steps back, I saw his face and was dumbfounded at the scene and could not believe my eyes. When I looked at him, His face was pale in color, and when I looked up at his face, his eyes were pitch black. There was no white in his eyes whatsoever. For a moment, I was sworn that I was sleep deprived, but my eyes could not believe it. His dark black eyes were staring at me intently, and he smirked at me. I was so frightened that my legs went numb, and I could not feel myself breathing. Shocked and scared at what I just witnessed, I fell back in fear. My dad saw me falling down and helped me get up. When I got into the car, my father started the engine and began to drive away. I looked back at the machine he was standing beside. He kept staring at me, and he silently walked away. His eyes still haunt me today, the creepy smile and color of his skin. I just knew he was not human. I heard about a woman in white from my mom when I was little. The woman in white is believed to be a creature who takes shape when you look into her eyes. She's not a ghost. She's something else altogether. She apparently has white flowy clothing and white shimmering hair. Her eyes are also white in color. Parents usually tell stories about her in order to keep their children home before it's dark outside, at least around here. My mother used to tell me stories about her. As I grew up, these stories became more like tales to me until one evening. It was early winter, and I was returning home from a birthday party. I was driving a car as it was nighttime. There was not many people on streets. The only lights on were the street lights. I was driving slow because the wooded areas near my house, and I spotted a few deer and their baby fawns. Halfway to my home, I saw something very bright on one side of the road. I did not know what it was, but as I approached it in my headlights, I turned them off, and what I saw was out of the universe for me. It appeared to be the woman in white, the one I had heard the stories about. I could not believe it. The light was hurting my eyes, since she was illuminating light. I could barely breathe, and she was levitating. Her long white dress and long sleeves touching the ground. She was around 7 feet tall. Her long and alien-like physique was shocking, but her long bright hair were shimmering, the way the whole dark area was lit by her presence. She seemed supernatural, but again, not a ghost or an apparition. She appeared to be some sort of entity, and not human. Her hands and fingers were unusually long. She looked so unreal. My eyes almost went blind for a second, before I could understand anything. And before I went unconscious, she telepathically spoke to me. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the car, and the streetlights were even on, and so were my headlights. My head was spinning. I could not believe my eyes, but I saw the woman in white, or an alien entity. Perhaps that is exactly what she is. I drove away as fast as I could, and the whole scene was coming off in my eyes. I could not take my mind off it. When I got home, I explained this to my mother. She, of course, did not believe me. All of this was just a story to her. I fell ill the next morning and kept dreaming about her for around a month. My nights were disturbed because of her sudden appearance in front of me like that. I guess her spotting was reported by several other people, and, like me, they had all reported seeing the same thing. I guess one evening, a man had actually disappeared after he had reported seeing her or it. They could not find a single trace of him, and the case was supposedly closed. Another disappearance. 2 more people did as well, also reporting the same thing. The residents, including us, left the area. We are now settled in Ohio. I'm purposefully being vague about this southern Ohio town in which I'm talking about. I don't want people to go there. I do not want people to see this woman in white. Even now, people are scared of it. And while many may not believe my story, this entity is very, very real. I'm going to tell you about one of the most bizarre nights of my life. It happened about 10 years ago, while I was still a senior in high school. It traumatized me so deeply, and I sometimes still wake up in a cold sweat. My 2 friends, Mark and Jenny, and I were driving to our friend's, Jack's house. Jenny was recently gifted this Mazda, and she offered to drive any time we were going somewhere. Besides, she's a great driver, so we always felt safe with her behind the wheel. Jenny and Mark had picked me up at 7 p.m., so it was already getting pretty dark out. Jack used to live on the outskirts of town and drove out to him. It took about 30 or so minutes. The shortest road to his house took us through the forest. The road was slicing through the woods, which stretched on both sides. It was a 2-lane road, but the asphalt was very rugged. It had a lot of cracks all over it. Even though it was not very busy nowadays, I'm sure there was a lot of traffic in the past. The road was mostly straight on, with not too many curves and turns. In spite of all of this, all throughout this part of the road, the line was continuous, which meant that there was no way we could pass anybody. That was not a problem for the most part, because there was nobody in front of us, until about halfway onto the road. Once we turned onto that road, we could see far out in front of us. There was a car going in the same direction. We quickly caught up with them, but we could not pass them, so we slowed down and followed. The road was going over several slight hills, and every time we began to slow down, the hill we were able to see this road in front of was his truck. We drove like this for a solid 10 minutes, which is when we let the driver slam on the brakes so hard we could see the skid marks it left. We could clearly hear the woman screaming, and it was the scariest scream I've ever heard. For a few moments, we stood there, not knowing what had gone wrong. I was sitting in the back seat, and both Jenny and I kept asking Mark if he could see anything, because the passenger seat was the closest right to the right side of the road. It was obvious that something had happened on the right side of the road. For a minute there, I considered the possibility of something happening to the woman inside the car. Maybe it wasn't anything external, but that thought quickly went away because it was obvious that something had indeed come out of the woods on the right and stepped onto the road. This was what caused her to stop the car so abruptly. Now, you are probably thinking something like a deer, or maybe some scary wild animal might have run out onto the woods and the road. That's why the woman was so scared. I can tell you one thing for sure, after all these years. It's like that thing was not an animal. At least, not anyone that I've ever heard of. It was hunched over, kind of like a monkey, propping itself up on what looked to be 3 limbs. It kind of had the body of a monkey, but it had no fur, and its skin was white. Its face, however, looked far more human. High cheekbones, and the shape of its eyes were more human. The skin, though, were sickly white, and its eyes were sunken in, save for a pupil. It was bizarre and terrifying, and also very alien. Its nose was flat, or non-existent, slightly hollow. I'm not sure at this point. We were able to see this thing clearly as it slowly moved across the road, and by the time it was in the opposite lane, we could all see it clearly. It turned around to face us once it hit the other side. I'm still not sure if it was an attempt to tell us goodbye or to show us what it could have done to us. As it turned to face us, its mouth stretched into a grim smile, exposing these black, yellow, sharp teeth. They were sharp as nails. It made me gag. Once its sadistic smile kind of faded, it appeared sad, like a child. The whole time it was crossing the road, it moved slowly. You could say it looked like it was kind of limping, like it was injured, but the second it reached the woods on the other side, it disappeared so fast our eyes could not follow it. The woman in front of us turned her truck around and sped off, right back where we all came from. We saw her crying and wiping her face, so she could see the road now. I don't know what we were thinking, but Jenny decided to keep going to Jack's. Neither of us complained, and we all agreed that it's for the best we stay the night at his house. We reached Jack's after about 10 or so minutes. We pushed past him at the door and greeted him once we were inside. He began making jokes about how scared we were, but none of us laughed. Jenny was still visibly shaken, which is when he realized something serious had happened. We told him all about our trip, and the next morning, we took him with us to my house. While we were driving up that road, which happened last night, we came across the skid marks the truck had made. If any of us had any doubts about the reality of what we saw, now we were sure that it indeed happened. We are still trying to process this sighting.